On March 4th, 2006, Captain Trevor Greene sat down with members of his platoon from 1 PPCLI to have a meeting with the elders of a village in Kandahar, Afghanistan. The intent was to discuss the means of working together and finding peace in Afghanistan as part of our mission there to support stability after the major operations in 2001, the victory of the Northern Alliance over the Taliban. And this was really at the beginning of the resurgence of the Taliban in southern Afghanistan to a major political and fighting force. And so Canada had recently come from where we had been in Kabul doing very limited operations as security of the main base up in Kabul, and taken on a major role as a fighting force to go down and to curb the resurgence of the Taliban down in Kandahar, while the British were in Helmand, where it was also very intense and starting to rise into major violence. So Captain Trevor Greene and his comrades had gone to meet with the village elders in this small village and to discuss how they could work together in order to bring peace and stability. And in the midst of the shura, a young man named Abdul Karim, who was 16 years of age, who had been somehow driven to an act of defiance by the Taliban, whether it was through education or teaching that this was the right thing to do, or whether it was because, as in many cases, the Taliban exerted pressure by bringing threat against family and friends that they'd held his family hostage. We really don't know. What we do know is that he came to the shura where the Code of Pashtunwali ensured the safety of all guests, even enemies. It was a sacred code, is still a sacred code amongst the Pashtunwali code of conduct. And he brought with him a homemade axe, which he drove into the brain of Trevor Greene through his skull. There was a member of that crew that was with him that reacted immediately and engaged the young man with his personal firearm and shot him in the chest, killing him very quickly. Trevor Greene was then, he was casevaced by helicopter. Black Hawk American helicopter came in and managed to provide life-saving first aid and brought him back to the Roll 3 surgical facility that was in Kandahar airfield and kept him alive, brought him to Landstuhl, Germany, where he received secondary care, and then onward, after he was stabilized, he was moved back to Canada. At the time, it was assessed that Captain Greene would never regain any semblance of self. It was believed that the wound to his brain was far too severe, that he was most likely to be in a vegetative state until he died. Now, the circumstance was such that if I were to pick 3 people who were deeply impacted in their in their brain activity by this event, just as examples, you could look at Captain Trevor Greene, whose brain was severely physically damaged. You could look at Abdul Karim, who was subject to the cessation of all brain activity in death. And you could look at a friend of mine who was there, and I won't give his name, but who afterwards went on to have a very successful military career, including Special Operations Service but who was deeply hurt by the experience emotionally and mentally, and I could say is subject to post-traumatic stress disorder and various other maladies as a result of the trauma of that incident. And so in 3 cases you have one whose brain stopped working, one whose brain was fundamentally physically altered, and one whose brain was, one could argue, also physically altered, but not by actual physical interference, but by input overload, perhaps, as we've talked a lot about thus far in the series that I've been doing on mental health. And so the question that I want to address in this is, are we our brains? Are you, in fact, anything more than a series of chemical interactions and electrical events that are going on inside the physical lump that is in your skull? This is really an investigation into whether or not you have a soul. And so, if we were going to look at this, there's a real question that is raised, and in the comments of one of my previous videos, someone going by the tag Rainbow Devourer had observed that it is difficult to believe that you have a soul when somebody can have a brain injury and be a completely different person as a result of that brain injury. And they looked at the idea of the frontal lobotomy and the consequences of that on a person. Now, I have some familiarity, by the way, with frontal lobotomies, mainly through my mother's experience. My mother worked as a nurse in neurosurgery for quite a few years and was responsible for the care of an individual who had been lobotomized as a violent criminal. And her description of that person was that they seemed utterly lost and just broken and sad. And they seemed not to be present in their interactions. And so in a real way, you can look at that and say, well, does that mean that we are, in a sense, an illusion, that what we think of as ourselves, is that real, or does that go away? Is it just an electrical event that can be changed, and then ourselves can also be changed? And really, this comes down to a much larger question, if you want to think about it. So we'll talk a bit about Trevor Greene in a second and his own experiences, and we'll talk about the experiences of an individual who has gone through PTSD and perhaps is even still subject to it. And the question is continuity of self, right? So when we talk about the soul, what exactly are we talking about? Is this some kind of spiritual thing that exists inside of us that isn't us? Or is it us, and is it tied to our physiology? Do we in fact truly exist, or are we just kind of figments of our own imagination? And so you might really ask yourself, to get some context in this, am I the same being, the same self, that I remember myself being when I was 6? And you can think back to earlier experiences, and when you put yourself into the shoes of your memory, that's you looking out of those eyes, and yet the you that is now remembering that is fundamentally altered in knowledge, in experience, in perspective, in nurture, and also, one might argue, physiologically, because of experiences that you've had, perhaps concussions you might have experienced, or chemical overloads that you might have subjected yourself to, whether willingly or not. And so, in a very real way, your brain is very, very different now than it was when you were 6. And yet, you do still identify with that as you. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon, because we do have continuity of self. And of course, our experience of self must have continuity, because if it didn't, then you couldn't actually complete a thought. The you that is in the present, that you identify as you, in a kind of real way, it has to transcend the present. It has to extend into the past and also into the future, because you have a thought that is going to be a future expression. As you carry through that thought, slice by slice, if you will, infinitesimally thin slices of now, the self's thought is being carried from the past toward the present through an infinite number of slices of now, and it continues through that with coherency. And so in that very simple way, you can recognize that the self must carry through time, and it must extend backwards in time to draw upon past experiences and even the reasonings that have gone on to carry you from the start of this sentence to the end of this sentence, and the start of the conversation to where we are now. And of course, you'll also experience fractures of that continuity, as you might have a lapse in memory that causes you to forget what you were talking about a few minutes ago and have to jump back and try and recapture that, and so on and so forth. But there is somehow a you behind that process that is doing the isolation of the idea into the now and the present. And so you have to address in a real way, what is that? What is you? And I think it's very helpful to look at Trevor Greene's situation and to say, here is a man who was subject to a grievous injury to his brain, such that it was assessed that he would never recapture who he was and would ultimately never again be in control of his body, that he, perhaps you might say, had dissipated. But of course, it's a very interesting story, and you can certainly follow it for yourself if you have an interest in that. There are a number of articles in Maclean's that are actually written by Trevor Greene, discussing his experience with this trauma and going through this trauma. There's a book that he wrote with his wife Debbie called March 4th, and if you were to look for it, you could find that there was a whole documentary done called Peace Warrior in 2009, which discusses his recovery and the neurology of that recovery. It's really quite fascinating, because you see his brain was severely impacted by a scarring cut that fundamentally impaired the way that his brain could ever function again. There's no way that can heal. And yet, as you go through it, it's very interesting that he was able, through careful care and through the science of neurology and understanding how to, through behavioral training, bring someone through an injury and to develop a lot of the things that were lost in other centers of the brain. And so by going through therapy, he was able to essentially relocate himself into new parts of his brain. And that's really fascinating, because he basically rewrote the programming inside of his brain into new places. And here's just a little bit of an article that he wrote back in 2016. And he wrote, "It's been 10 years since an axe was plunged into my head in Afghanistan. Over the past decade, I have often mused about the attack and my 16-year-old attacker, who journalists identified as Abdul Karim. By harming a guest at Ashura with tribal elders, Abdul broke a centuries-old pact known as Pashtun Wali, which demands that guests, even enemies, be fed, given water, and most important, protected. The Taliban must have put him under an intense pressure to commit such an abomination, akin to shooting a gun in church. They could have kidnapped his family and threatened to kill him, or convinced the illiterate Abdul that it is written in the Quran that he would reach paradise if he killed an infidel. It took me a long time to forgive Abdul, but I had to in order to begin healing. Now, I think that you can observe just by hearing those words that this is a man very much in control of his brain, that his intellect is alive and well, that he's very capable of addressing his reality and engaging with his reality, and that the damage that was done to his brain did not actually remove his self. And that's very interesting as well. So you'll note, for example, that Trevor Greene says, "I have often mused." Well, who is it that's doing the musing? Well, it's Trevor Greene. He certainly identifies with his previous memories, although he's lost a lot of them. And he is attached to them. He still has continuity of self, even despite the deep impairments to the physical structure that is designed to interface with the world. He was able to move himself into other parts of it and still holds on to the previous self, even if there are personality effects from the impairment that was done to his reasoning computer that he uses to interface. That's really fascinating and really important, is that he had to deal with what had been done to him. His self had to work on forgiveness for that person in order for him to heal from the damage that was done to him, right? His self was very much intact, and so that fundamentally brings about questions, right, as to what is the nature of self? What is this brain? What is it doing? How does this all work for us, right? And they're very important questions, because if we are just reasoning animals that are accidentally gifted with self-awareness, then the continuity of self is an absolute illusion. If materialism is true, then ourselves are simply physical processes, right? And then the I that Trevor Greene is experiencing now, even though he identifies with his previous sense of I, is actually not truly connected to it, because the new I is a different I than the old I, but that's not how he perceives things, and that's very interesting. So what are we looking at here? It's an important question. Now, if we were to look at the individual who struggles, and Trevor Greene, by the way, also was subject to PTSD, is still subject to PTSD as a result of that, unsurprising. And something else that's really relevant here is that Trevor Greene essentially has no memory of 2 years following his brain damage, no memory at all of that whole process of growth for 2 years until he could gain control of his own brain again. Although there was engagement between his brain and the people who were working with him, with his wife, that whole portion of their book is written by his wife, because he has no memory of it until he could come back into control of his brain and start recoding things that were memories. And he has this big gap, but he has before and he has now. And now that the recoding was complete, the him is able to continue in its interaction with the world. But there was a gap there where, although interaction was happening, it wasn't coded in as memory. And that's really interesting too. But then you take the PTSD case, and even without physical damage to the brain, that fundamentally alters your interaction with the world. It fundamentally alters your emotions. It can fundamentally alter your personality and the way that you experience the world. You have depression, you have anxiety, you have times when, against your will, you have living reenactments of events that jump into your consciousness, perhaps. And so you're not in control of this computer inside your head anymore, right? And maybe you never actually were, which, again, begs the question, if there is an I that seems trapped by this computer that's running away on memories that it's not being asked to replay, who's looking at the memories? Is it a figment of the same runaway brain? Why do you look at it almost as an outside observer? Why do you experience the depression or the anxiety as one who is being subjected to it, and it's not actually felt as yourself? And that's also a really interesting question. And here we come to what's really important about trying to parse this question out, is that when we look at the question of self, we deal with a really fundamental argument, which is to say, first principle kind of argument about how exactly does the world work? How exactly do you work? What exactly are you? And I think it's very helpful to turn to Cornelius van Til in this. And Cornelius van Til is an American philosopher of the 20th century, quite influential, and also theologian, a Christian bloke, right? As, by the way, most of the major philosophers were. So don't let that somehow discredit him if you're coming at this from the materialist perspective. Your whole way of looking at the world is deeply influenced by these Christian philosophers, and even the rationalism was originally derived by Christian philosophers like Rene Descartes. So here's Van Til, and he's looking at all these things, such as, is there a God, is there a self? And he comes to the conclusion that it is impossible to use outside proofs, because there is no such thing as an outside proof for the existence of God or against the existence of God. It's actually a recognized problem amongst atheist philosophers. You can't actually prove that God isn't there. They choose to look at the world and try to derive what they think is the best evidence of whether or not there is a God, and they come to their conclusions. And that's interesting, but at the end of the day, here is where Van Til's position is very important, because he put forward the idea of presuppositionalism. Presuppositionalism dictates that there are certain things, the ultimate presuppositions, which cannot be proved by the usual methods as serve as the basis of other proofs. Okay? Now, why is that? Because an ultimate presupposition is a presupposition about how things are. And it is that from which you derive all of your other reason. You cannot, and you can look at all the philosophy around this, and it basically demonstrates the proof of what Van Til is saying, is that you cannot reason your way to an answer about whether or not you truly exist, or whether or not you are, of course, the butterfly dreaming about being a man, or nothing, or a materialist an accidental sentient spawned out of chaos that somehow perceives itself to exist but doesn't really exist outside of a material illusion. For example, you have to actually look at it, and you have to prove that, and Van Til said this, that you have to prove it transcendentally by showing that these things are necessary for all rational thought, that they must be true or there is no meaning. Right? So, in a sense, what he's saying, something that I've said on here before, which is he's arguing the same position that Jesus argued when he said the kingdom of God it belongs to such as these, referring to these children, and that unless you come as a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, this is interesting as well, because Descartes who you know because he famously said, I think, therefore I am, among other brilliant philosophies, which he is considered the founder of rationalism, by the way. And Rene Descartes looked at all philosophy that had gone before him, and he said, I must start without their thought. I must start fresh. I must start with no presuppositions, and I must look at my experience and use that as the foundation of my philosophy about what is and what I am and what nature is, right? And so here you have this coming as a child to philosophy. I'm going to erase all of that from my thinking. I'm going to force it out of my mind and just be in my reality and then derive conclusions from what I experience in that reality. And Rene Descartes, the founder of rationalism, as Van Til argued, this is the foundation of any meaningful thought. It is impossible to be rational until you first look at your experience of the world and then derive from that foundation stone the realities that are underivable, because they are the foundational realities from which everything else must be derived. And so I ask you, if Rainbow Devourer is listening, or if you are listening to this and you are uncertain if you can know that you are in fact a self, a soul, a being that is real, that you must simply get rid of materialism, okay? Just throw it in the garbage heap for a second. Get rid of everything that you have had pumped into your brain by your education, and just stop for a second and look at yourself. The reality is that you do have a continuity of self. You know that you do. You experience that. That is your felt experience of existence. That you are, in fact, a person, a thing that isn't just your body. That it's not that the person who was you at 6 is actually you, even though your brain was fundamentally different. And therefore, I am not my brain. I am something that is working through my brain, as would be evidenced by Trevor Greene's recovery and ability to retain himself while he completely reprogrammed his brain to serve as a conduit between that self and the outside world. And if that is true, it fundamentally alters what you are looking at when you're looking at someone with a frontal lobotomy. And you have to realize that. It's a derived, rational conclusion that what you're seeing is somebody with a mechanism for engaging with the outside reality that has been so badly impaired that the self is not destroyed. The self is simply trapped, right? And it's no different in that sense than if I were to pluck out your eyes, that you would not cease to be just because you couldn't see, and neither would reality cease to be there even though you couldn't see it. Like, it's as ludicrous to suggest that someone who is colorblind would say that I do not believe there is color, even though everyone around me says that they experience color. They would recognize that, in fact, there's something impaired in their vision that does not allow them to perceive what is truly there. And if your eyes can't see something and you feel it with your fingers, you're not going to then say, that's not there because I can't see it. Particularly if you remember once having had seen it, right? And so there is a self that is using the brain to engage with the reality around it. It's a logical conclusion, but it is a conclusion that must be derived as an ultimate presupposition. It can't be derived by reasoning your way through it by scientific measurement. It has to be derived solely from experience, because that's all you have. It's not a measurable thing. And so when you stick with Dawkins' materialism, for example, you basically cannot look at the soul and derive meaningful understanding from it, because you have already said there is no soul by virtue of using materialism as your ultimate presupposition. And you might say this is a circular argument, but again, Van Til makes the very sound observation that all arguments are ultimately circular. And you can see this when you come right down to it. Like, I'll give you an example. So one of the blokes that I talked to has spent some time listening to Terence McKenna, so I took the time to listen to Terence McKenna and understand where he's coming from with his whole psychedelic thing. And it's interesting that he has built an internally consistent worldview based on the fundamental presupposition that mushrooms, magic mushrooms in particular, but actually fungi as a whole form, is some kind of seeded physical organism that is not native to our reality. And you can derive this, he says, by looking at how it's fundamentally different from the animal and plant species that are otherwise everything that we experience in the or can observe in the world. And so it is something that came from somewhere else, and that if you take the mushrooms, that is allowing you to engage in this multidimensional voyage in the self that takes you into a different dimensional experience where you can perceive the ultimate reality or whatever. Now, the interesting thing about that, I hope I don't lose you here, is that is actually kind of an internally consistent narrative that sort of explains experience of the world. And there's a lot being given to that, actually, a lot of weights given to that argument. Joe Rogan, I think, is very much following that vein, and I've certainly met or seen other thinkers and mental health advocates and, you know, the new age spirituality kind of guys or the new paganism kind of guys that are looking at that as the stoned ape theory of consciousness, and this is where it all comes from, yada, yada, yada. And it kind of works, sort of. And so it's a circular argument, though, because it's all rooted in this unprovable presupposition about mushrooms. Just as materialism is rooted in the unprovable presupposition of there being no creator or divine architect over everything that we see, and therefore they are, you know, in order to establish that, turning to things like multiverse theory and string theory, which are arguably, possibly valid as part of quantum mathematics. You can derive the possibility that there might possibly be an infinite number of universes, etc., which, again, is no proof. There's no actual evidence of their existence or anything. You're stuck with this ultimate presupposition. And so you're stuck with that it must be proved transcendentally. What does that mean? It means you have to delete all of the outside information in your conceiving of whether or not these things are true, and go to your felt experience and see what that is telling you, because that's the only mechanism you have for deriving these kinds of things. And so, you know, you have that I think, therefore I am. That's not a stupid proof. Like, I think I am having this conversation with you. We are beings that are engaging through this electronic medium, and that's a huge deal. So then, what are you? You are something that is not just your physical self, and you experience that, and you must start from that in your understanding of everything else. And that's really important to your ability to deal with things like post-traumatic stress disorder. Because functionally, if you believe that you are just a brain, then when an axe gets stuck in your brain, you, without an identity of self, you can't rewrite that brain to re-express you, right? You're gone. You died. Someone else is here now. But that's garbage. That's not Trevor Greene's experience. And it's not the experience that I have. I've had like 7 concussions. My brain is physically damaged. There's things I can actually remember when I could think better, when my memory was capable of feats that I can't even dream of doing, when my concentration was far better than it is now. But that was still me, right? And I know that, and you know that. So if you have PTSD, if you have some kind of depression or anxiety syndrome, if you can recognize that that isn't you, it's a thing that is being put in front of you, and it's impairing your ability to perceive and interact with the world, then you can start looking at this thing and say, that's not me. I can start peeling that away. Maybe I can take a medication that'll let me see through it a little bit. Maybe I can start changing the way that I think so that I can control this thing instead of being controlled by that thing. Wow, like totally different perspective on things. And then you can start looking at the experiences you have even beyond those kinds of syndromes, and you can recognize things like, when I get angry with my wife, is that me? Or is that, that perhaps I have an addiction and it's billowing up inside of me. Perhaps I'm having these hormones that are affecting the way that I'm thinking. Maybe I'm aging. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe there's these other things. Maybe there is a physical aspect of myself which is filling me with passions that aren't actually me, but they're going up between me and the world, and they're trying to influence the way that I interact with the world. Now, this is also Descartes. Descartes defined 6 different fundamental passions which influence the soul, and he called them wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. And he described these things as being the primary experiences of the passions that come from the flesh, which includes your brain, which try and get in front of your soul and the world and influence the perception and interaction with the outside reality that only comes through your flesh, through your body. And then you can come to some really interesting conclusions about how you might begin to control the way that your soul interfaces with these things, and the way that your soul works by getting through the screen and getting out to reality without being constrained and becoming a slave to these things. But then again, I would say you will find yourself in an experience where I believe that you will not be able to defeat them because they are too strong for you. But it is you that they are too strong for. And so then we come to some other really interesting ultimate presuppositions. There is a you. It is looking out through the eyes of your brain, if you will, to engage with reality. And that is your felt experience, and that is the ultimate presupposition you must come to. But through brain damage, through mental damage, through nurture, through accepted knowledge, you have deeply constrained that perception, and you need to recognize, and this is the idea that Jung talks about of being fully conscious, by the way, that when he talks about the soul, he describes it as a perspective, but he goes a lot more deep in his description of the soul. He identifies that as the self, and all of these things as being like roots and vines that are wrapped around the self, and you need to be fully conscious of all of these influences upon you so that you may then not be completely constrained by them. But I also think that Jung, he did not take it far enough, because he always wanted you to wrestle against these things which are stronger than you, that are too physically robust for you to defeat in your own strength. And so you need an outside help. And this is, of course, where I come back to that thing I always come back to. The other thing that Rene Descartes, the modern philosopher who founded modern philosophy and rationalism, said, God exists because nothing comes from nothing. And that was his transcendental truth. He also recognized the experience of God. He recognized that there is a sense of the other that all people have. And there is a sense of the other that all people have. You yourself have a sense of God's reality. Now, you might have dulled yourself against that willfully to the point where you don't experience that consciousness anymore. But I think that if you examine yourself, if you really get into this full consciousness, you will begin to reawaken your awareness of the reality of God, and that there is indeed this hole in you that needs to be filled. There is a weakness in you that is almost reaching out for this God, and it's not without cause that in the vast majority, even of our present atheistic reality, that people experience the soul and recognize that experience is true, and that they recognize that there must be a God. They have that sense, and so even in agnosticism, there is a sense that I do have this sense that there's a God, but I don't believe I can know him. It's really only the stalwarts who have come to the conclusion that there must be no God, because they have chosen to go into the logical empiricism of naturalism to such an extent that they have cut out those feelings as being credible witnesses of reality. And they've cut them out to the extent that they are denying that. So the vast majority of people believe there is a God. The vast majority of people throughout all of history, and even in present day, are religious in some sense or spiritual in some sense, because that is a natural need of humanity to drive yourself to something higher that is not part of this physical reality, to seek after that thing. And the reason that is, this is the other transcendental truth that you cannot derive scientifically. You have to go to it through experiential observation. That ought to lead you to seek out who that God is. And if you seek out who that God is, then you can come to the place where you might actually reach out to this God, and you might find Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who made God conceivable and reasonable to our understanding, so that we might have real relationship with him. And you might perceive this Jesus Christ, who supposedly died on the cross in 2,000 years ago and claimed to be the Son of God, claimed to have risen from the dead, or at least his apostles and disciples, some 500 of them, claimed to have seen him and were willing to die for that observation in defiance of all rational thought. They gained nothing from it. They were beaten for it. They were killed for it. And they pursued it with fervor because they believed it. They felt it. It was a felt experience. It was a transcendental presupposition derived experientially. And you can reach out. You can shut out these things that are screaming at you, no, don't, no, it's not good, no, you'll lose all rational thought, you'll become a heretic of the modern thought process, you'll be an enemy of Dawkins, the great savior, right? The great savior from religious foolishness. And you can shut that out and become like a child and derive your reality experientially instead of through these things that have been forced into your brain by the education system, right? That are no more credible as foundational ideas than any other, and derive your own foundational ideas like Descartes did, and reach your hand out and say, I feel that there is a God. I perceive that there is a God. I will reach out to that God. I will believe in this Jesus Christ that I feel to be real. And boom, your life will fundamentally change, and your lenses will change, and the self will feel the fundamentally new experience of having the power to overcome the passions that are derived from the flesh and from your brain, and to become fully conscious as you work through these things in the power that is lended to you from this very real Creator God who loves you enough to have become like you and died for you. And your whole experience of life will be altered in such a beautiful, powerful way that you will look back on the self that was before. You will still recognize that self, but you will know what it is to have grown in your perception so far beyond that self that you look upon him as a pitiable figure. And now I'm describing him as someone else. You'll look back on yourself and you will see how constrained you were, and yourself, who is still that self, will be able to perceive how much brighter and how much more hope there is in everything, and it will fundamentally alter how you can fight against these things that seek to constrain you. That is true for the Trevor Greene. That is true for the soldier who was plagued by hurt and despair and trauma from that. It's not true for Abdul Karim, though, because his opportunity to engage in any way through his interaction with reality, it's gone. It's gone. It's snuffed out. He has no longer got a mechanism through which he may engage with existence. And so where is he? What is his reality? Has he ceased? Now, a lot of you might suppose that of course he has ceased. And yet, tell me if that's experientially your experience of self. Does your self think that it's mortal? Does your self believe? Because you can do this. Not your brain, not your logic, not the way you've been taught to think. Does your self think that it is going to cease to exist? It believes it is immortal. This is the folly of young men, is that they truly believe they're immortal. And as you grow older, you consciously become aware of your mortality. But the self does not want to die. It does not actually believe in its ability to truly die. And so what is that? Well, what I would tell you that is that it's because your soul is immortal, because God is real, because you are really you. You will have an immortal existence. Your body won't, your brain won't, but you will. And so it's kind of important whether or not you take the time that you still have, because your flesh is going to die, and you choose to think about these very, very important things in a real way that isn't just whatever you are told to think, whatever you have been taught to do, and you challenge those ideas with your experiential transcendental knowledge in such a way that you come to the realization that there is a God, and you best turn to him, because otherwise your eternity that you are going to experience is going to be a very, very unpleasant experience as you are cast out of the presence of the eternal light and into the eternal darkness, rather than having the opportunity to know him well constrained by your flesh now, but then to know him completely and purely and goodly, and also ultimately to have your body back and to be able to enjoy that whole mechanism without the constraints of its sin-debilitated hurt and constraint and the passions that want to cause you to hurt other people. And so that's what I have for you today. You do exist. You are real. You are eternal. You are not your brain. That is what you experience. Trust your experience. And then be afraid that you haven't got it figured out yet, and go and look for God. You need to. And this is my war story about how you can not be like Abdul Karim, but you can actually be permanently preserved from fear, from danger. You can have hope in spite of everything. You can defeat these things that strangle you, and you can become a new person that is alive in a way that you have never been alive in Christ Jesus. Godspeed, my friends.